The scariest plane hijackings in history. Let's just get right into it. This first plane hijacking ended with 125 passengers trapped in a sinking plane as water slowly filled up their lungs until they couldn't breathe anymore. Yeah, let me give you some background information. It was the year 1996 on November 23rd. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 had been in the air for about 20 minutes. When suddenly 3 suspicious-looking Ethiopian men got up from their seats and bursted into the cockpit of the airplane, armed with an axe and a fire extinguisher, where the men grabbed the pilots and threatened to blow up the entire plane in mid-air if the pilots did not obey their demands. Alright, if you were the pilot, what would you do here? Because the hijackers then started to mock the pilots, saying that they were basically screwed because they had 11 total hijackers on board. After they grabbed the airplane technician that was on board and brutally assaulted him, they stepped over his body to grab the radio and make an announcement to everyone that was on board. Everyone started to panic as they heard these hijackers say that if anyone tried to interfere with their plan, that they would blow up the whole plane. Want to know the worst part? They didn't actually have a bomb, and it was later revealed by authorities that the bomb was just a bottle of liquor. Good gosh. Now you're probably wondering, what were the hijackers even demanding from the pilot? Well, they wanted the plane to be flown to Australia. Why Australia, you might be wondering? Well, ladies and boxheads, that's because they believed they could seek asylum and avoid being prosecuted for the crimes that, they're about to commit. Alright, there was one big problem though, because the plane did not have enough fuel to make it all the way to Australia from their current location. Because obviously the plane only had enough fuel to fly the original destination. And for anyone that was wondering, that was Addis Ababa, Ethiopia to Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. I really hope I'm saying those right. The captain tried begging the hijackers to understand that the plane would deadass just not make it to Australia. But they didn't believe him, and honestly, they were probably right not to. Because the pilot tried to steer near the African coastline to gain the attention of air traffic control, despite being under the pressure of having 3 armed men hovering right over him. Anyways, the hijackers caught on to what the pilot was trying to do when they noticed that there was still land visible from outside of the plane window. And for anyone that's wondering why that's important, it's because Australia's across the water, no land, you get it. Because who else would fly the damn plane? They forced the pilot to steer east towards Australia. As the pilot was still pleading out in fear of running out of fuel, boom, there was a huge explosion from the back right side of the plane. The damn right engine just flamed out. The hijackers then bursted out of the cockpit in fear that the plane was going to crash. Yeah, that's what the pilot was trying to tell you this whole time. The pilot then quickly turned around and grabbed the radio to make a public announcement. And hold on, I'll actually read the exact statement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot. We've run out of fuel and we're losing 1 engine at this time. And we are expecting a crash landing, and that's all I have to say. We have lost already 1 engine, and I ask all passengers to react to the hijackers. And after a tough battle, the plane plummeted through the sky at 200 miles per hour when it smashed right into the Indian Ocean. I'm actually gonna play a live feed video of the actual moment. Panic erupted as the plane began sinking rapidly. Water started to flood the cabin, and everyone quickly turned to put on their life jackets. But that right there was a fatal mistake, as many of the passengers inflated their life jackets way too soon and ended up trapping themselves inside the sinking plane. And 125 out of the 175 passengers on Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 lost their lives that day, including the 3 damn hijackers themselves. Now, this next hijacking is one where the man who threatened an entire plane with a bomb was never actually caught. Yeah, now you're probably wondering how a hijacker on a plane, with hundreds of people being able to identify him, escaped the cops. Well, ladies and boxheads, let me start from the beginning. It was the year 1971 on November 24th, and the Northwest Orient Airlines 305 was set to fly from Portland, Oregon all the way to Seattle, Washington. I said all the way, but it's not that far. When a suspicious white male in his mid-40s took a seat near the back of the plane. This man is none other than the legendary D.B. Cooper. You'll understand why this man is so legendary in about 2 minutes. Oh, and before I forget, here's the man's actual plane ticket for this hijacking. Yeah, it's kind of rare that you get to see something like this. Anyways, the airplane took off and everything seemed pretty normal on the flight, like nothing out of the ordinary. Until Cooper got up from his seat with the briefcase in his hands and walked to the front of the plane to show a flight attendant what was inside. Any guesses what was inside the briefcase? No, dumbass, it's not the subscribe button. Why would that be in there? I mean, since I brought it up, you should join the 11,000 of us and hit that subscribe button. Anyways, there were red sticks with batteries and lots of wires attached to it, and the flight attendant started panicking in the middle of the airplane when she realized that it was a goddamn bomb. And like you would expect, the whole flight crew took his demands seriously after, seeing what was inside the briefcase. What were his demands, you may be wondering? Well, he wanted $200,000 in cash. That was supposed to be placed in a satchel, and also he wanted 2 front and 2 rear parachutes. I think you may know where this is going. Oh, and he also demanded food for the entire flight crew. That's kind of thoughtful, don't you think? Now, if you remember, the original destination for the flight was Seattle. 5:39 p.m. PST, the Northwest Orient Airlines 305 landed on the runways of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, where the ransom was prepared for DB Cooper. But obviously, he wasn't going to step out of the plane and just grab the satchel and parachutes himself. Like, that would be stupid. So he made one of the flight attendants bring it to him, where he then turned around to everyone on board and shouted out that they were allowed to leave the plane, except the flight crew had to stay on board. Because I mean, the guy needed some leverage, right? You can't just let everybody walk out the door. Now here's where things get a little bit weird. After everyone left the airplane, Cooper gave orders to the pilot to fly to Reno, Nevada. And get this, at an exact altitude of 10,000 feet with the rear staircase of the plane lowered and extended. Yup, you know where this is going. As the plane flew over the woods of Washington, this man forced the flight crew to stay behind the first class curtains and full on sprinted to the back of the plane and jumped right out. No, seriously, like straight out of the movies. Deploying his parachute while holding the bags of straight cash. Everything happened so fast that the planes that were trailing the hijacked plane never saw Cooper jump. And it was too dark outside for anyone in the flight crew to have seen Cooper through the side windows. And guys, that was the last time anyone has ever saw or even heard about DB Cooper, until the year 1980, 9 years after this plane hijacking took place. When this small kid named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family on the Columbia River, when he stumbled upon 3 packets of the ransom cash from the flight. Yes, for some reason, instead of pocketing the money, these people called the police. A better man than me, for real, I would have pocketed that cash personally. Anyways, the FBI has actually confirmed that the money was indeed a portion of the ransom money from the hijacking. But still, there was no sight of the legendary DB Cooper until this day. He has never been found. Alright, this last plane hijacking is one that lasted for 54 hours straight, where the hijackers almost blew up the entire plane in the name of God. And I know what you're probably thinking, it's not 9/11. So let's just jump right into it. It was the day before Christmas in 1994 when Air France Flight 8969 was boarding all passengers ready to depart Paris-Orly Airport in Paris at 11:15 a.m. Quick side note here, the plane had 220 passengers and 12 flight crew members on board. 4 men fully armed with weapons boarded the plane with all of the passengers. Want to know something interesting? No one was freaking out or even was alarmed by the 4 men. Why? Because the men were dressed as the Algerian presidential police. Yeah. 2 of the men were even inspecting passengers' passports. This part is going to be really important later on in the story, so do not forget this part. Basically, the hijackers were trying everything in their power to appear as the police. Except here's where everything went wrong. One of the flight attendants noticed that one of the police officers were armed with dynamite while checking the passports. Before we get back to the flight attendant's reaction to the dynamite on the plane, the real Algerian police thought it was suspicious that Air France Flight 8969 hasn't taken off yet. So they sent out a team to surround the airplane and, just check it out. The hijackers looked outside the window and realized that the police were catching on to something being wrong, which is exactly when the flight attendant realized that the 4 police officers on the plane were actually terrorists. Yeah, you heard me correctly. The men then yelled out to everyone on board that they were mujahideens seeking to establish an Islamic state in Algeria and not the police. And for anyone that doesn't know what mujahideen means, it's basically a person who is performing jihad, or basically someone who's trying to fight against the enemies of Islam. These men were not just hijackers, they were a part of the armed Islamic group, or to put it really simply, a terrorist group. As everyone on board started to scream out in fear, the hijackers started waving around their assault rifles, submachine guns, pistols, and even their homemade hand grenades with 10-stick dynamite packs. The hijackers then bursted into the cockpit and attached one pack of the dynamite right under the seat of the pilot just in case he misbehaved, and one more pack of dynamite right under the middle of the aircraft so it could blow up evenly when detonated. As the men were attaching the wires to the dynamite, they forced the pilots to take off their uniforms so that they could wear it and confuse the Algerian army snipers that were stationed outside of the aircraft. But to make things really easy to understand, I'm just gonna keep everyone wearing their regular clothes like throughout this section. Everyone on board went completely silent when they heard the intercom starting to buzz on. But the silence didn't last long. After one of the hijackers delivered this message: Allah has chosen us to die, and Allah has chosen you to die with us. Allah guarantees our success, inshallah. Yes, they were ready to kill 220 passengers and 12 flight crew members in the name of God. Just keep in mind that the plane hijacking took place before 9/11. Just thought that was kind of interesting. I forgot to mention that the hijackers objected to men and women sitting together, and the women on the airplane not having their heads covered. So what did they do? They went down every single aisle of the aircraft and forced women to cover their heads with blankets, and also forced them to stay away from the men, even if they were family. I mean, kind of strange to do this in the middle of a plane hijacking, wouldn't you say? Anyways, the whole cockpit went silent when the radio started broadcasting the voice of the Minister of the Interior of Algeria, and he demanded to speak to the terrorists. The men then grabbed the pilot with the gun pointed to the back of his head and forced him to speak to the minister on their behalf, where the demand made was for the release of two Islamic Salvation Front political leaders, Abbasi Medhani and Ali Belahaj, who were under house arrest at the time. And a quick side note, they actually later dropped this demand. Now, the minister demanded that the hijackers release the children and the elderly, if they even wanted a chance to speak with the Algerian government. Here's where things started to escalate. 2 hours had now passed since the start of the hijacking, and the men refused to give in to any of the demands of the minister. So they decided to storm into the cockpit and demand that the pilot fly the plane to Paris so that they could hold a press conference. Yes, a press conference. One problem though, the pilot couldn't take off because the aircraft's boarding stairs were still attached, and the Algerian authorities were also blocking the runway with parked vehicles, which is when they grabbed the pilot and forced him to ask that the boarding stairs and cars were removed. But the Algerian authorities told them to basically screw off. You'll understand why that was the biggest mistake ever. So these dudes left the cockpit to announce to everyone on board that they were gonna detonate the bombs to blow up the whole aircraft unless the Algerian authorities listened to them. Even with everyone's panicking, the Algerian authorities still did not remove the stairs or the vehicles, which is when the men then realized that they had to take it one step further. Remember that I told you that these hijackers checked everyone's passports in the beginning of the flight? Well, apparently one of the passengers on the flight was an Algerian police officer, which the hijackers knew that they could use to, leverage the authorities, because surely they wouldn't let one of their own die, right? The men went from aisle to aisle searching for this officer, and as the men were approaching him, he started begging for their mercy, yelling, "Don't kill me, I have a wife and a child." But as soon as they got to him, they grabbed him and dragged him to the top of the boarding stairs, where one of the men pulled out his pistol and shot him point blank in the head, and let his body topple all the way to the bottom of the stairs. Now, a quick side note here, no one on board actually knew that the officer was shot dead. But guys, guess what? The Algerian authorities still refused to agree to any of the hijackers' demands. In response, the men stormed out of the cockpit once again, grabbed the first passenger they saw, dragged them all the way to the top of the boarding stairs, and with no remorse, shot them right in the head. Yeah, 2 people were brutally murdered just because the Algerian authorities wouldn't listen to any of the demands. But guys, get this, the French government wanted to bring in their military so that they could, resolve the hijacking. But the Algerian government refused to have any foreign military step foot in Algeria to help them. Like, good lord. But now let's focus back inside of the plane. The pilots of the airplane knew that if they didn't do anything from the inside that, they were probably going to die. So they attempted to gain the trust of the hijackers by trying to show the hijackers that the passengers on the plane were people too, with lives, families, friends, and just trying to make them personable. Hours went by and it was now 2 a.m. the next day, December 25th, 1994. The pilot woke up and opened the door of the cockpit when he started walking down the aisles to make sure no one was hurt and the cabin was completely silent. Everyone was asleep, and when he looked down, the two hijackers were sleeping on the floor. Peaceful, don't you think? Well, the madness that day was only getting started, because it was leaked by the Algerian Secret Service that the hijackers' real plan was to crash the entire plane with everyone in it right into Paris. Alright, here's something you may find a little bit interesting though. The hijackers actually decided to release some of the passengers, who were mainly women and young children, to show a sign of good faith or something with the authorities. Now, the men actually offered to release the Algerian passengers too, but they wanted to stay on the plane. Yeah, you heard me correctly. These people had the opportunity to leave the plane but chose to stay on it. Why? Because the Algerian passengers thought that if they left the plane, they would also be shot like the other people. Which is honestly kind of fair, but at this point, there were still 170 people remaining on board. But it seems like the men were playing nice now, right? I mean, they let people leave off the plane. It seems like the situation's getting somewhere. Well, as the hijackers were in the plane, one of the men noticed that the lead hijacker's mom was walking towards the aircraft. The mother then pleaded for him to release the passengers and tried to persuade her son to give up. The lead hijacker, Abdullah, was furious that the government would even bring his mom into this. By the way, it was the French government's idea to even bring his mom in the first place. And somehow the hijackers knew that, because they then decided to take out all of their anger on the French passengers on board. Alright, there were two French passengers, a secretary and a chef. Between the two, they grabbed the chef and forced him to beg for his life on the microphone. While having the gun pointed to the back of his head, they forced him to plead out to the Algerian government to clear the runway for takeoff before 9:30 p.m. or else the hijackers would kill one passenger every 30 minutes. As the time was ticking, they forced the man back to his seat, where the other Algerian passengers were assuring him that the hijackers were just bluffing. Like, seriously, bluffing? What part of this whole story made you think that these psychos were bluffing? Guys, 9:30 came around and the Algerian government still refused to allow the airplane to take off. So the men walked over to the chef, raised their guns and shot him right in the head. Then opened the doors and threw his body out like trash. That brings our kill counter to 3. When the French government heard what the Algerian government allowed, they were so pissed that they basically told them that they would be held responsible for the outcome of the hijacking if they didn't let the French help. And ladies and boxheads, after 39 hours after the start of the hijacking, the plane was finally allowed to depart. One problem though, the plane didn't have enough fuel to make it from Algiers all the way to Paris. So they were planning to make a quick pit stop at Marseille first for fuel. When the call came in that they were allowed to depart from the airport, it was said that the hijackers were jumping up and down and even hugging each other. Yeah, what a group of oddballs. It's now December 26th, 1994, marking day 3 of the hijacking. Air France Flight 8969 landed in Marseille at 3:33 a.m. The airport was dark and cold, with lights only coming from the airplane and the car that was leading them to the refuel station. Now here's where the French government set the hijackers up. The French military was stationed near the airport with plans to storm into the aircraft while it was refueling. Oh, and also, the car that was leading them to the refuel station was actually leading them to a remote part of the airport, so that, the French military could penetrate the inside. Wait, pause. Anyways, when the plane was at a full stop, the hijackers forced the pilot to demand 27 tons of goddamn fuel. By the way, the airplane only needs 9 tons of fuel to make it to Paris from Marseille, which basically meant that the plane was either going to be flown to an Islamic country that was supporting the hijackers, or they were just trying to create one huge ass bomb. Anyways, hours went by, radio silent on both sides. At 8 a.m., the hijackers demanded that the French let the aircraft take off by 9:40 a.m. And listen, instead of spitting in their face and just, flat out saying no, they decided to delay the takeoff by giving the aircraft more food and water. Also emptying the toilet tanks and even provided vacuum cleaners. And guys, this is where the fun begins. The airport personnel servicing the plane were actually undercover French military operatives. And when they were on the inside, they planted eavesdropping devices in the plane. Also, they found out that the aircraft doors were not blocked or booby-trapped by the hijackers. And get this, the hijackers didn't even know that the plane doors could be opened from the outside. In just 12 hours of the plane landing in Marseille, the French knew how many hijackers were on board and their exact location on the aircraft at all times, with the help of the planted spyware and infrared vision equipment. Alright, but the lead hijacker suspected something was up, so he ordered the pilot to move the aircraft. Now you're probably wondering, what was the French's game plan here? Well, there was a group of 30 men with 3 passenger boarding stairs ready to rush over to the aircraft, and obviously take it over. Now, it was time to execute. The clock hit 5 p.m. and the men were waiting by the radio to hear from the authorities, expecting 27 tons of gasoline to be delivered to them. Minutes went by and nothing. The lead hijacker was infuriated when he rushed out to the cockpit and grabbed a 4th person to execute. Except this time he selected the youngest member of the Air France crew that told the hijackers earlier that he was actually atheist. Why would you tell these people you're atheist, man? What's going on? But get this, the leader actually didn't want to kill the 4th passenger. He even looked at the young man and said, "I don't want to do this, but I have no choice." As the hijacker opened the airplane door to kill the passenger execution style, on the boarding stairs, the man just started firing at the French military instead of killing the guy. The 170 people on board started to scream out in fear, as everyone heard the intercom buzz on with the voice of one of the hijackers reciting the verses from the Quran that were prayers for the dead. Think about that. You're hearing a man pray for the dead. The dead is you. And ladies and box heads, this is where the French had enough and began the bloodbath. The French start charging to the plane with boarding stairs on all sides of the plane. As the hijackers started firing their automatic weapons right at them, one of the French bullets struck one of the men and he instantly died, leaving only 3 of the hijackers still standing. As the bullets were flying through the wall, the men turned around and bang! Ears ringing and smoke everywhere, the French had just chucked smoke grenades into the airplane, filled with innocent people and the hijackers. Side note here, the grenades actually temporarily blinded some of the passengers on board, but I guess it was, necessary. The French military then stormed into the aircraft. In a panic, the hijackers detonated their homemade grenades to try and keep the French away from them. As all of this was going on, the passengers were being evacuated at the rear end of the airplane. When all of the passengers were out, the snipers started firing shots into the airplane, hoping that one of the bullets would land. And after just a few minutes, 3 out of the 4 hijackers have been shot and killed. Then one of the sniper's bullets pierced through the airplane ceiling and hit the last hijacker, where after 20 minutes, he dropped dead from the bleeding coming from the gunshot wound. And guys, with all of this chaos, only 13 passengers suffered super minor injuries with no deaths. Obviously, outside of the deaths that I, told earlier in the story. But if you want to hear about times millions of people were slaughtered, click this video right here where I talk about the worst genocides in human history.